When I'm working with brands and auditing the work that they've done, we often forget about this key demographic. Gen X tends to be more peer-oriented than other generations that preceded them. Probably what happened is you just can't strong-arm your way into marketing successfully to Gen X. They tend to just care about functionality and value. So you need to actually focus on R&D and the product itself. The steak is in fact more important than the sizzle.
I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you.
Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Today, I wanted to start by bringing us all back to 1993 when four non-blondes asked a very important question for the culture, which was, what is going on? Sadly, 30 years later, I don't think we've been able to give them an answer yet. And I do think that's a perfect place to kick off today's episode. I'm going to continue this little mini-series I've been doing where we're diving into different cultures, how they are perceived, and what are their actual lived experiences, and how can we take all that information to better understand how to communicate with them. Today, we're diving into what is largely known as the Forgotten Generation, which I do think is a really mean nickname, also known as Generation X, Gen X for short. They're mostly chilling, They're predominantly unproblematic faves in society who just put their head down, get the work done, and we've sort of allowed them to slip into the background in a lot of ways. One of my very good friends I would describe as quintessentially Gen X. I'd say she's like a personal hero of mine. I like to go to her when I want to be regaled with stories of old, like what was it like to experience the OJ trial, and also what the heck was up with Woodstock 94? She is so effortlessly cool and chic in a way that I think perfectly encapsulates Gen X. There's a real nonchalance to the way that she moves about the world and a real individual streak in how she takes in and absorbs culture and sort of allows it to be part of her but not defining, which makes Gen X so interesting to sort of try to appease in marketing because of the way that they've all grown up. I would say that they, more than anyone, have genuinely had it the hardest. I very intentionally plan to have the Gen X episode follow the millennial episode from last week because I do believe that a lot of the strife millennials think that they have sort of shouldered the burden of has actually been Gen X shouldering that burden, but just doing it so quietly that none of us are really aware the depths of their suffering. Gen X cares about functionality, they care about quality because they have to. We're going to dive into some of the economics around how they've grown up and come into adulthood, but they really haven't had it easy. I also think when it comes to social change and culture, Gen X is super interesting. A nice, I think, tight little example of this is that Gen X women have really been at the forefront of this movement of talking about their experiences with perimenopause and menopause. It's a really interesting dynamic where I think we all can see there has been a huge shift in culture and society around how we approach these basic moments in a woman's life. But Gen X women didn't do it in a way that was like, aggressive, and they didn't do it in a way that demanded attention. They just simply wanted to talk about this thing, and they did. They wanted to create products and companies that addressed menopause and perimenopause, so they just did it. I think that's a quintessential Gen X reality, and they never get any credit for anything cool they do. So, who is Gen X is actually a really valid question. People seemed very confused when I was talking about this episode, and also they do have the nickname of the Forgotten Generation, so it does, again, really make sense that nobody really understands who they are. But Gen X is the generation of folks born directly after boomers but before millennials. So that puts them in the age range of being born in the mid-60s to 1980. They sort of, in my opinion, came to be the middle children of society because of this animosity that's almost always existed between boomers and millennials. Gen X has been forced into this very passive state where there are, kind of enemies on either side, and they just have to get on with life and with what they're doing. So if that's who they are, technically speaking, you might also be wondering where they are, which is a really good and interesting question. Baby boomers are called baby boomers because there was a baby boom and a lot of them were born. I think that's a really, it's so obvious, but oftentimes we forget about that. So Gen X, they were being born at the forefront of family planning, which is really interesting to think about why there are maybe less of them and why they sit in this tiny little pocket themselves. If they were born, between the mid-60s and 1980, that means that they were born predominantly in the 60s and 70s, and that was a really substantial era of revolutionary social change in the way that we see a nuclear family. With family planning available to more and more people, we were just more focused on people getting into the office, people working, compared to what was going on with child rearing. So I think we as a society in those decades made great strides, but we were really focused on the rights of adults versus how we were raising our children, which made total sense at the time, not like poo-pooing what boomers are doing in the 60s and 70s when it comes to social change. I'm just saying it's very interesting to note that a really big chunk of that social change came from adding women to the workforce, which means that Gen X, being that generation behind those women who were going to the workforce, were the first generation to really grow up with the expectation that both parents were going to be working. So comes the phrase latchkey kid, another very mean nickname in the canon of Gen X. A latchkey kid refers to kids whose parents were both sort of working in their after-school hours. So the latchkey kids come home, open the door by themselves with their key, and they're sort of alone until dinner time. Something that is really interesting to me about, thinking about how many boomer parents of Gen X kids would have been working when they were quite young, is that Gen X tends to be more peer-oriented than other generations that preceded them. So probably what happened is we had these communities of kids who were sort of left to their own devices earlier than other kids had been in history and really formed communities with one another, which I love. Sort of without audience, without adult guidance, they just started to grow up as everyone does in childhood. And it's really interesting to consider the impacts that first generation of kids with freedom would have really felt. I'm not saying that boomers grew up with really tight restrictions as children. I'm just saying that there were less adult eyeballs on Gen X, so they were really free to formulate their own identities, hobbies, interests with one another, which is where I think that sort of peer-oriented mentality does come in. Recently, a study conducted by Ipsos found that in books written over the last 20 years, millennials are referenced 5 times more than Gen X, and a scan of social media shows that Gen Z is mentioned 4 times more than Gen X. So again, that really signals why they're maybe perceived as the forgotten generation, because they're not being talked about and they're not talking about other generations. They don't run their mouth, those Gen Xers. They just sit quietly in their lane. Last week, we talked a lot about millennial nostalgia and their constant craving. That was a Katie Lang reference for any Gen X people listening at home. But yeah, we talked about millennial nostalgia and their constant craving for the 90s. But what is so totally wild to me, and again, why I wanted to have this episode directly follow the millennial episode, was that a lot of the culture that they love and embrace as their own was pioneered by hardworking Gen Xers with divine taste in music, TV, media, all of it. Really earnest, dorky millennials think that they are so cool and counterculture with their niche string instruments and wide-brimmed hats, while Gen X actually invented culture and punk and the punk scene as we sort of know it today. Gen X, in my opinion, braided together their morality with art and movement. They didn't just post online about social change they wanted to see when they were young. They invented spaces and platforms in the real world to push through the change that they wanted to see. I think a really great example of this marrying of genuine progress and culture and art, and also just a really good example of Gen X culture, is the history of the Riot Grrrls and their impact on feminism, the punk movement, and kind of society as a whole. They were present in the early 90s. Riot Grrrls came onto the punk scene that already two people in the punk scene felt inclusive and boundary pushing. So as per usual, it was just sort of a bunch of guys jumping around, excited that they had invented social justice yet again, focused on environmental issues and a lot of issues of class. But we were missing a really big voice when we talk about social change, which was women. So we started to see bands that were all girls gain prominence and momentum in the scene by just screaming about the things that bothered them as young women in the early 90s. The musical mantra of the day was really to just do it yourself, which the Riot Grrrl sound, I think, encapsulates beautifully. There's an almost unfinished quality to the music that they were making, which adds to the edge and the grit, and also, I think, the art, and just makes it this really cool experience. It doesn't feel rehearsed. It doesn't feel overly practiced or planned out, not in a way that sort of tells us that they didn't put a lot of effort into it, but in a way that feels really genuine and authentic. The Riot Grrrls had stuff they wanted to say, so they just said it, which also ties into this entire theme of Gen X just doing what has to be done. Like a lot of feminist or social movements, the lines between what is Riot Grrrl and what is not are kind of blurry to this day, and people never really agree with the definition of what Riot Grrrl really was. Was it a genre of music? Was it just the zines? Is it an era of feminism? I think personally it's a mindset, sort of a culmination of everything. I also think there's no end to Riot Grrrls. I still listen to and connect with the music today. I feel like one of the greatest discoveries of my 20s has been Bikini Kill, a pioneering punk band and a group that's basically synonymous with the Riot Grrrl stamp. I actually think that listening to Rebel Girl really kicked off my own curiosity around Gen X and this whole idea of a forgotten generation, because it was so impactful and I could see the sort of threads that were tied from that song, that moment in art, up until today. One of my favorite lines from that song is, "That girl thinks she's the queen of the neighborhood. I got news for you. She is." Beautiful. I love listening to that song. In the late 90s, we ended up with very fun, light, and airy versions of what girl power was. We saw the bands rise, like Spice Girls, which is really fun, but Riot Grrrls, I think, really changed the collective culture around girl power and feminism by fighting for their voices to be heard in a punk scene and then inevitably heard by the whole world. They really were stripped of any inclination we might have to present women's issues and voices in a really sanitized, accessible manner, and they instead sort of forced people to come to their turf, how they wanted to present themselves, and didn't make it easier for anyone to engage with them, which I really love. But they also didn't stay away from tenderness and love and just sort of classic girlhood. They just got it. They built on progress that came before them, and I think that they really truly saw a vision for equality in the future. So I feel like a good question is genuinely, where are the Riot Grrrls and where's the rest of Gen X today? Something that's really interesting to note, in America, Gen X is the first generation to have over 50% of the people in that generation college educated. They're also the first generation where women outpaced men on their levels of education. Such a serve, and also kind of ties back to what I was talking about at the top of the episode. They're really talking about menopause. They're really going at it during the kind of peak punk years. They're just a cool group of women. Same with my friend. But Gen X as a whole is also, interestingly enough, not like technologically challenged. They have a real comfort and ease with the internet, having been young people during the rise of the internet itself. They're not fully like digital natives, but they also don't shy away from learning new technology, which has given them a real edge as they've gotten older. So as a whole, we're talking about a group of highly educated people entering what is typically the prime of their careers, or at least in terms of like power that they're going to hold in the workplace and the economy. What I find very, very interesting about Gen X at this point, and this teeny tiny little generation of latchkey kids who are predominantly raised by boomers, and also have raised significant amounts of millennials and Gen Z kids themselves, they're now at the helm of a lot of decision-making and purchasing power, whether they are supporting their parents or supporting their children. They're really, like I said, just sort of at the helm of a lot at this moment in history, and we're still really ignoring them. Also, if I'm being honest, when I'm working with brands and auditing the work that they've done, we often forget about this key demographic, which I think is really, really interesting. I see a lot of brands come in who seem like they would be a great fit to approach Gen X and really focus on Gen X, who sort of just write them out of their ICP in general. In my opinion, Gen X is the generation most capable of just getting things done, from Riot Grrrl feminist rallies to shouldering the brunt of responsibilities today. Gen X just silently making sure that we don't lose the plot is so on brand for them. What is also deeply interesting to me when I think about Gen X and how they came about in the world is the economics of their generation compared to their current purchasing power. So something that is incredibly interesting about Gen X is I think a lot of the times we assume that they will just know what they want and they will know when they want it. And I think because, like I mentioned, a lot of Gen X is now hitting this time in their life where they're in a lot of positions of power and upper management, they maybe have erased their own sort of sensibilities when they are looking to bring products to market. But I think that they just want something or someone to show them functionality and value, because those are the most important pieces to them, but to also do it in a fun way that does connect with them. Largely, they don't need to make a purchase to feel like they're part of a collective, and they're also savvy enough not to fall for any kind of virtue signaling in your advertising. We often ignore them, I think, because they're kind of hard to capture, but that's dumb, in my opinion. Maybe I just like a challenge, I don't know. So here's what's interesting and why this episode is a little bit different from other explorations of other generations. You just can't strong-arm your way into marketing successfully to Gen X. They tend to just care about functionality and value. So you need to actually focus on R&D and the product itself. In this instance, when you're talking to this group, the steak is in fact more important than the sizzle. This whole conversation also really reminds me of one of my favorite stories of the ability to be agile in business, which is in 2006, Fujifilm pivoted into skincare. They didn't fully, obviously, shut down their camera operations, but it's more of an expansion, I guess, than a pivot. And it feels very Gen X coded. Some quick sort of backstory here is that we all know and love Fujifilm as a camera company. For me, a stinky little Gen Zer, I think there's something really mythical and magical about film cameras. I love my film camera. It is annoying to have to get it developed, so I can really see why and how the digitization of photography hit the world so quickly when that technology became available. It would be very innovative and attractive. So Fujifilm in the early 2000s started to see numbers decline as the world shifted around them and film became less sort of common practice and more niche. What they did is so interesting, so smart, and so Gen X coded. They looked within and realized that yes, they did sell really high quality film and cameras on the market. Best of the best. And that market was being threatened by something totally outside of their control. So when they reflected inwards, what they realized was that they weren't necessarily just a camera company, but they were an R&D company. Their research and development and their dedication to pioneering net new ways to develop film and to do it efficiently was what actually really made them valuable. So they pivoted, taking what they learned from years of innovation in film and started producing skincare with proprietary anti-aging technologies. They really let go of their ego. They made something that worked, and they were cool, calm, and collected. They moved with the times, and sure, between 2006 and now, film has a lot of ways sort of returned, but they ultimately diversified and they survived, which I think is a perfect allegory for Gen X. In their youth, Gen X was often dismissed by boomers who would refer to them as slackers. But the facts are Gen X did not enjoy the same financial privileges as boomers, or in fact millennials, and Gen Z. They didn't get to ride a soaring, strong, healthy stock market in their 30s, which is when a lot of people will be thinking about buying stocks if they're going to. And also just when you're coming into prominence as a person in your career, your 20s are kind of like, right off, right? And then in our 30s, we kind of all lock in. What's so interesting and almost sad is that when you look at sort of median Gen X salaries throughout 2011 and 2017, there wasn't a whole lot of growth. So again, we see this pattern of behavior where they batten down the hatches, get through whatever comes at them, and they do it with such grace and dignity that we all forget that they're doing it. That was a very quick crash course on Gen X. I do think that they, again, are so underappreciated in society and also underrepresented in marketing plans because we just tend to think they're very difficult consumers to reach. But they're fun and they have a lot of cool references in culture and they are just chill. There's nothing else to say. They're not they shouldn't be forgotten because they're quiet and they get the work done. So, in conclusion, I don't know what's going on. I try to figure it out myself by reading. Some people try to figure it out by painting or exploring, and others prefer to just not think about it too deeply and live a more peaceful life, which is a little bit of a spoiler for my episode next week on baby boomers. What I do know, though, is Gen X is never going to get enough credit or really any substantial help. They got the short end of the stick and they just didn't complain, and for that we should celebrate them instead of forgetting about them. I think this is something boomers like to talk about a lot, and so it's interesting that their own children oftentimes are the ones who really experience this. But Gen X have maybe had the worst generational luck of anyone, and they've just handled it, which I think is a great lesson. And I think also gives us a lot of cues in how to approach them in marketing. Like I said, they are not going to be swayed by what everyone else is doing typically. They're very set in what they need and also what they need their products to deliver. They seem to acknowledge that their lives wouldn't be as good as their parents, and then they just got on with it, doing the best that they could, keeping focused on value and quality and their own variations of research and development, like Fujifilm. We tend to think of demographics like them, who buy based on value and quality, as being a group that's just going to come to a brand when they need it, and I think that's really lazy marketing. And I personally don't want to be a lazy marketer. I don't know about you, but personally, I don't want to be. So I would really start thinking about the value that your product actually brings to the market if you are at the helm of a brand that could easily pivot to a Gen X ICP. Something that's really interesting too is like they are moving into a different era in their lives. So what we may have previously considered for Gen X might not actually be what they're shopping for today. So again, start thinking about the value that your product actually brings. Something that I do is I will book time with an R&D team, a product team, or even manufacturers to really get down and dirty and figure out what makes your product worth buying. I think that it's really important to understand the technicalities behind things. I often do yell at brands who try to be too technical in their advertising, but what I do believe is that you can't really create good advertising if you don't have the technical knowledge yourself, because you need to know what's going to kind of push them over the finish line at the end. And when you're thinking about top of funnel stuff, you want to almost lay the breadcrumbs for the big discoveries on the PDP. So yeah, reach out to those teams, book those little meets, and figure out what is the actual strategic advantage of your product. If you sell water bottles, what does your water bottle do better than all the other water bottles on the market? Because answering that question isn't only going to help you appeal to Gen X, but it's also going to help you appeal to larger audiences as a whole. So those people might not make the best creators per se, the R&D departments and the manufacturers and the engineers behind your product, but they are really thoughtful, unsung heroes in your brand, sort of like Gen X's in society, and they really don't deserve to be overlooked. In fact, they should be celebrated and their work should be acknowledged, and their work is also incredibly valuable to what you're trying to do. That was the episode for today. I hope you enjoyed it. As I said, slight spoiler, next week we're going to be chatting about boomers, and the week after Gen Z, which is very exciting. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, and I can't wait to talk next week. Thank you.